By sunrise, a two-story restaurant floated in the middle of Evan Mercer's lake like a trophy someone had stolen and dared him to take back. Barges idled, diesel haze clung to the water. Hard hats moved with calm entitlement. Then, in less than a day, the only real access to that lake became useless behind an immovable wall of stone, and the entire project turned into a quiet, expensive trap. Evan had bought the house for one reason: silence. The listing promised a private lake, the kind that slowed weekends and made the air feel clean. The shoreline curled behind his backyard, and near the reeds sat a solid concrete boat ramp, wide enough for trailers and clearly older than the neighborhood's neat rows of mailboxes and matching fences. For a while, the HOA was just background noise, dues paid, grass trimmed, minimal waves at community events. Evan kept to himself and spent mornings fishing or gliding through the coves in a kayak, letting the water swallow the stress of the work week. But the board started acting different once they realized what the lake represented. More meetings appeared on calendars, more committees formed, more talk of improvements and revenue and community visibility. The lake stopped feeling like a feature and started feeling like a temptation the HOA couldn't stop circling. The invasion arrived on tracks and trailers. Evan woke to heavy machinery grinding through the neighborhood, the sound vibrating through walls like a warning. Through the trees, he watched a tug pull a barge onto the lake, then another, cutting wakes across water that used to sit glass still. Within days, the barge became a platform, then framing rose, then walls. Workers arrived in a steady parade and used Evan's ramp as if it were public infrastructure. Trucks backed down, unloaded lumber and metal, and left the shoreline bruised with ruts and tire marks. The lake's calm was replaced by hammering, engines, and the constant clank of floating equipment. Evan pushed back the normal way, with emails, calls, and documents. The HOA leadership responded with polished certainty and selective rules, insisting the water surface counted as shared space while avoiding the land boundaries that made their entire operation possible. Evan wasn't just losing a view, he was watching his quiet purchase turn into someone else's commercial plan. The restaurant grew faster than anyone admitted it would. Generators buzzed late, barges bumped and groaned against makeshift anchors. The shoreline started feeling less like a backyard and more like the service lane for a business that hadn't opened yet. Then came the paper pressure. Notices appeared accusing Evan of obstructing a community improvement simply for documenting trucks on his land. He received warnings about signage when he marked his property near the ramp. A complaint was lodged after he filmed deliveries and equipment. None of it was enough to win a clean court case, but it was enough to drain time and energy. A lawyer confirmed the worst. Evan owned the land beneath the lake and the surrounding property, but the HOA bylaws were foggy around surface water rights. Fighting the floating structure itself could take years, and the board was counting on exhaustion. That was when the flyers started spreading through the neighborhood, announcing a grand opening and turning the restaurant into a public promise. Evan watched the countdown shrink and realized the moment they opened, the problem would become permanent. The final push came disguised as logistics. A delivery schedule circulated, and it was massive. Refrigeration units, kitchen equipment, tables, chairs, decor, supplies. Most of it was planned to arrive by boat. And every boat, every trailer, every heavy load depended on one thing the HOA did not own: the ramp. Evan stood at the edge of it and studied the evidence like a crime scene. Tire tracks baked into concrete dust, flattened grass, the shoulder chewed into mud. The board hadn't asked permission because asking would have admitted Evan had the power to refuse. He could already see the next stage: customers drifting past his backyard, lights reflecting across the water at night, music and trash and strangers turning his shoreline into a backdrop for someone else's revenue stream. The grand opening with "Lock it all in." That evening, Evan stopped trying to win through complaints and started planning around boundaries and leverage. Night turned the neighborhood into a stage with the lights off. Evan brought in boulders, heavy stones delivered quietly and rolled into position with careful precision. He followed with quick-setting concrete, sealing the entrance into something that could not be shrugged aside by a committee vote. By dawn, the ramp entrance had become a brutal barrier, a wall of rock fused to the ground. Along the perimeter, fresh private property signs made the message unmistakable from the road. Morning delivered the reaction. The first delivery truck arrived, towing a boat loaded with expensive equipment, and stopped hard at the edge of the blockade. Confusion spread. Calls stacked. Vehicles collected behind it like a traffic jam built from bad assumptions. HOA leadership arrived with visible outrage and frantic urgency, acting as if intensity could rewrite property lines. When officers finally showed up, they stayed neutral and focused on what mattered: deeds, boundaries, and access rights. The ramp was private land. No one could force Evan to open it for a commercial scurration. In under an hour, the power shifted. The floating restaurant didn't look bold anymore. It looked stranded. The HOA tried everything that avoided admitting fault. They offered money to rent access. They raised the offer when Evan refused. They held emergency meetings and proposed workarounds, but every solution collapsed under the same reality. A commercial operation cannot survive when its supply chain is a muddy footpath a quarter-mile away. Weeks passed into months. The floating restaurant sat finished and useless, a bright structure with no heartbeat. From Evan's porch, it looked less like progress and more like a monument to overreach, bobbing gently in the sun. Eventually, the board surrendered to math. Contractors returned, not to celebrate, but to dismantle. Piece by piece, they stripped the structure down and hauled it out the hard way. Neighborhood excitement curdled into embarrassment. Policies quietly tightened around property boundaries. Leadership quietly rotated. When the final barge cleared the water, the lake returned to stillness, and Evan got back what he had purchased in the first place. Now the question that sticks is simple. If an HOA can convince itself it owns your view, how far would it go before someone finally draws a line? And what would you have done in Evan's place?